Hello, puppies and kittens. I am once again joined by Dr. Daniel Stern Cardinale, who is a evolutionary biologist, a geneticist of sorts. And I called on you, Dr. Dan, because it was this creationist who challenged me. Let me see where the note was. The creationist challenged me to find an evolutionary pathway for the Krebs cycle, saying that some creationists had posted that this was impossible to evolve, and they gave me a link to what looks like a peer-reviewed paper. So, and this is in PubMed, so we can expect that it is legitimate. It is Neo-Darwinism must mutate to survive. And the interesting thing about that is that one, a peer-reviewed paper that says neo-Darwinism? What the fuck is that? So this is the 21st century. We should point that out. So some people would refer to Darwin's theory of evolution in the 19th century was considered Darwinism. Then when you get the synthesis with Mendelian genetics, then it became neo-Darwinism or the modern synthesis. And now in the 21st century, because that was the 20th century version, in the 21st century, we have a new incarnation, which is the extended evolutionary synthesis. It's not Darwinism at all anymore. Neo-Darwinism was so last century. But, these people have to come up with some kind of bullshit excuse for how evolution is just another religious belief. We're not a religious belief at all, but they gotta pretend that we are. And one other thing before we get started with you, Dr. Dan, I just want to call out that the people who wrote this, Olin R. Brown and David Hollander, I had to look them up for a moment, and I could see that there's a handful of other papers with these names, and it's both of their names. And they're all criticisms of evolution. Every one of them. Biological evolution requires an emergent self-organizing principle. And when you listen to them talk, or when you read what they say, it seems clear they don't know what the words mean that they are using. Now, before I get into the rest of this, Daniel, would you please comment?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to talk about whatever nonsense thing some creationist has thrown your way. So I always love seeing that in my inbox. Is, hey, some creationist said this thing. Can we talk about it? Like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
always fun. So thank you for having me back. And so let's kind of big picture first, looking at this idea that neo-Darwinism must mutate to evolve. So like you said, this is the idea of the modern synthesis of evolution that really goes back to like the early and then kind of getting into the mid 20th century. So, I mean, like, I'm an evolutionary biologist. Am I a Darwinist? No. Am I a neo-Darwinist? No, because the overarching theory of evolution, right, this broad explanatory idea that makes specific predictions, leads to accurate predictions that we can verify, and then leads to further hypotheses that we can test, this big theoretical framework. We've already moved past neo-Darwinism. We were past neo-Darwinism, by the 1960s, 1970s, when you had a bunch of, population geneticists talking about things like neutral theory. That was a new thing. That hadn't been formalized really until into the 1970s. And, to say that like neo-Darwinism is still the operating paradigm of kind of evolutionary theory is just not an accurate representation of the field. And to be clear for your audience, like I teach evolutionary theory at a university. I teach the intro evolution course. And I talk about, as part of that course, the history of evolutionary theory, the development of it. And I have this figure that I use that's concentric circles of here's what Darwinism is, here's what the modern synthesis is, and then here's all the new things that we've layered on top of that since, the 1950s or so. And so like the entire premise here that the creationist is saying, hey, look, this theory, it doesn't work, it's out of date. Like the whole premise is flawed. Like we'll get into the nuts and bolts, but the premise itself is flawed. And we need to start there because, these kind of, a lot of times it's people who are not kind of in the field of evolutionary biology. A lot of times, much to my consternation, it's like philosophers kind of parachuting in and like kind of opining on the field of evolutionary biology, not realizing that like the thing that you're telling us to do we've been doing those things for decades.
Another thing I want to throw in there is I had an argument with somebody today who was insisting that I am an evolutionist. And I said, there's no such thing as evolutionism. And the argument was, well, yeah, evolutionism is just a belief that evolution happened. You believe that evolution happened. Well, technically, there would be, if you think something is true, then by one definition, that would be a belief. But if I think something's true, I'm going to say I think something's true. I'm never going to use the word belief again.
Right.
Because belief has taken on a new context. It's like the way, the way the word gay changed. If I want to tell somebody I'm happy, I'm not going to tell them I'm gay, because they're going to get the wrong impression. I don't want to leave the wrong impression, so I'm going to use a word that won't direct them the wrong way. And I tried to explain to this person who called me an idiot for not accepting that I'm an evolutionist, according to, because the dictionary says so. And I said, yeah, the dictionary says that abiogenesis and spontaneous generation are the same thing too.
Yeah, that's not
Look
true.
that up. Every dictionary says that. So anyway, and you can't correct them. I've tried. So I tried to explain to this guy how these people insist on trying the false equivalency, the tu quoque fallacy, either one of those, by trying to negate and dismiss all of our evidence and scientific methodology, by pretending that acceptance that evolution is a thing that happens is somehow a religious belief. And anything that you can't prove is a religious belief. Now remember that science has a rule that you can't prove anything. So that means that atomic theory has never been proven, and neither has the theory of gravity. So I guess what is the religion of atomic? The atomites?
Yeah. Sorry.
The gravitationalists, are they a religion too?
I want to go the Darwin route. We've got the Boris and the Newtonists. Just want to apply
exactly. And I found an article from Answers to Genesis. I'm looking at it right now. That talks about how they are deliberately using the word evolutionist, and Darwinism and Darwinist in order to cast scientific understanding as if it was a religious belief. They know that it's not, but they're going to use this. Well, the dictionary says so, therefore we can accuse. And so one of their descriptions here, I'm just going to quote right out of the article, says evolution is necessarily a belief because molecules to man evolution is not observable, but rather must be inferred and believed. This is why evolutionists are stumped when asked to give an observable example of one kind of creature evolving into a different kind of creature. And of course, it doesn't matter that there's no such thing as a kind, because this is young earth creationism. All they believe in is lies, so all they can defend it with is lies. Now, when I read some of the criticisms from creationists, because I'm going to read that now, I have been criticized for using a hillbilly kind of an accent. I mean, the accent that, frankly, I grew up with. The people that I most commonly, the creationists, in my formative years, whenever I heard somebody say something dumb about science, it was always with this kind of accent, right? But people have asked me not to use that accent when I read creationist comments. So I'm not going to do that. I am going to read the abstract of neo-Darwinism must mutate to survive. And I'm going to use a completely different, not hillbilly accent, but I am going to use a voice that I think is appropriate. Darwinian evolution is a 19th century descriptive concept that itself has evolved. Selection by survival of the fittest was a captivating idea. Microevolution was biologically and empirically verified by discovery of mutations. There has been limited progress in the modern synthesis. The central focus of this perspective is to provide evidence to document that selection based on survival of the fittest is insufficient for other than microevolution. Realistic probability calculations based on probabilities associated with microevolution are presented. However, Macroevolution, required for all speciation events, and the complexifications appearing in the Cambrian explosion are shown to be probabilistically highly implausible, on the order of 10 to the negative 50th power, when based on selection by survival of the fittest. We conclude that macroevolution via survival of the fittest is not salvageable by arguments for random genetic drift and other proposed mechanisms. Evolutionary biology is relevant to cancer mechanisms with significance beyond academics. We challenge evolutionary biology to advance boldly beyond the inadequacies of the modern synthesis toward a unifying theory modeled after the grand unified theory in physics. This should include the possibility of a fifth force in nature. Mathematics should be rigorously applied to current and future evolutionary empirical discoveries. We present justification that molecular biology and biochemistry must evolve to aeon life chemistry that acknowledges the uniqueness of enzymes for life. To evolve, biological evolution must face the known deficiencies, especially in the limitations of the concept survival of the fittest, and seek solutions in Eigen's concept of self-organization, Schrodinger's negentropy, and novel approaches. That is the abstract. And I'm not able to access the entire scientific paper. I don't know if you bothered with that, but what I notice in the abstract is that the guy really hates survival of the fittest. He doesn't call it by its proper term ever. He doesn't refer to natural selection ever, but he constantly goes over this other thing because he doesn't like that there is a mechanism that doesn't involve an intelligent design. He just really hates that. He can't tell the difference between microevolution and macroevolution, but at other moments he can. He says macroevolution is necessary for all speciation, right?
But
then he's talking
the
about
definition, right? It's speciation or more.
But then he's talking about what he's presuming to be incorrectly. He's presuming to be the emergence of whole phyla in the Cambrian explosion, as he put it. He's not aware that there's two phyla that were already extinct before the Cambrian explosion. Neither is he aware that we have any phyla that was prior to that at all. He thinks everything came about at once. And when we say everything, he's not representing, he wants to say that there are apes and fish and giraffes and rabbits and elephants and all of these things all happened at once, right. When in fact the only chordate that existed at the time was little more than a swimming worm. And that was like a protochordate. So there's a lot of misunderstanding going on here.
Yes.
And I don't know if you read any further into this to see that do they have a challenge, or is this just the argument that science can't explain things I don't understand, therefore magic?
So I have read this paper before. This is a fan favorite among some some subsets within the evolutionary biology community. Basically, we hate read it, we rage read it. Because this is a great example of like people who are not specialists in evolutionary biology telling evolutionary biologists how to do their jobs, not realizing that the things they're saying we have to do, we already do. Like, oh, you need to have a rigorous mathematical foundation for your theory. Oh, great thought. It's not like we've been doing that for literally 100 years. Right.
Look at the other papers that these people have written, these two, Hollander and Brown, right? Biological evolution requires an emergent self-organizing principle. Darwinian evolution has become dogma. Right? That's the central core of everything they say. And is there no more substance than that they don't know what they're talking about?
I think foundationally, the problem is they're not familiar with evolutionary theory, and then going from there, they make a bunch of critiques of evolutionary theory as they think it exists, not realizing that it does not exist in the way they think it exists. Like just going through the paragraph you read here, talking about the Cambrian explosion, and I think you're exactly right that there's this kind of understanding of the Cambrian explosion of we went from basically just kind of weird things in the oceans to more or less modern looking things in a very short period, single digit millions of years or tens of millions of years. In reality, the Cambrian explosion lasted 40 to 50 million years. And I don't even like the term Cambrian explosion anymore. I like the term Cambrian radiation because it describes what it is. It's a type of evolutionary event called an adaptive radiation, which occurs
And
when you have.
just to catch people up on what we're talking about,
Yes.
there was a problem in the 19th century when they were just starting to find fossils. They didn't know a whole lot about paleontology yet, but they knew that you can find all these seashells and bones and things like that right up until the Cambrian, and then suddenly you can't find anything. And so where did all these things come from? And what actually happened was that in this 40 to 50 million year period, one phyla developed shells, or I think it was two phyla that developed shells kind of at the same time. When I say at the same time, within millions of years of each other. Right. And then another group develops some other, or like hard spiky parts that are easy to fossilize. So now we have like 3 different lineages that we can find fossils for. Well, now that the technology has gotten better, and now that we have microscopic, microfossils, now that we can detect microfossils, well, there's a whole lot more. And it's not just microfossils too. They've found lots of macroscopic things from the Ediacaran, that are like 600 million years old or so, up to almost 700 million years, I think. So it's not the problem that Darwin once thought it was, but creationists are never going to do something honest and say, oh, well, you found Precambrian life forms now, so that whole argument is void. Okay, well, I'll have the integrity not to keep repeating now that I know that that's a lie. We know that's not going to happen. They're creationists. They need this lie.
And it's also not the case that even within the Cambrian, we have this kind of conception that it's like flipping a switch and all of a sudden modern life forms exist. But as you said, it's modern phyla exist, which are the rank below kingdom in the Linnaean system. It's kingdom, and then right below that is phylum. And the representatives of each phylum that we initially find in the Cambrian are not just very different from the living things in those same phyla. They're different from the representatives we find at the end of the Cambrian. There's a ton of evolution happening and diversification happening within the span of the Cambrian period. So it's presented as this kind of instantaneous event, and that's just not what it is. And it's been like expanding and expanding, and now we're keep finding, you mentioned the Ediacaran period, which right before it, we're now finding very clear precursors to the Cambrian phyla in those earlier strata. So it's simply not the case that it's the sudden appearance that it was once presented as.
So in the early Cambrian, we have things that look like, as I said, swimming worms. They appear to have notochord, maybe even gills, whatever. These are like soft-bodied impressions. Very small fossils, soft body. They're difficult to fossilize, but we still have found some. And so later, like in the middle of the Cambrian period, now we have things that are like hycoichthyes, which they're arguably fish. They're very nearly very, very primitive, but almost fish. And then by the end of the Cambrian, we have things that we would recognize and say, well, yeah, that's a fish. That's a really primitive fish, but it's a fish. So just to give people an idea of what was going on in the Cambrian. It was not that one day there's no life and then the next day there's thousands of things like the creationists constantly lie about. So I suppose at some point we should get to the principal thing. I remember that in Kitzmiller versus Dover, Michael Behe said that science will never find an explanation for what was it, the blood clotting cascade, or a handful of things that he mentioned.
Yeah, blood clotting, bacterial flagellum. Those are the two famous ones. There were a bunch of other ones, though. Yeah.
One of them, and I think it was a blood clotting cascade, when he said that science will never find an explanation for this. And that's when the other attorneys stacked on the stand 56 books and peer-reviewed articles, all explaining that. The thing he said they would never explain. These are things that were already published, already explained that. And he made up a bullshit excuse, which the judge, a conservative Christian Bush-appointed Republican was upset about, because he lamented how the intelligent design people would tout their religion, the religious beliefs in public, but then time and again lie on the stand and trying to to defend to conceal the true agenda of the ID policy. So that's what you got here. You've got something they're saying there. You're never going to explain this. It's probably already been explained, but they're saying this to people who want to pretend that if science hasn't explained something, then that's evidence of God, the God of the gaps. Yes?
Basically, yeah. This is, if you want to be a little more formal about it, then this argument is, you mentioned Michael Behe, this is basically a irreducible complexity argument, where you have this system, whatever trait it is, whatever system it is, and the way the argument goes is this is so complex and has all these components that are integrated with each other, such that if you remove any one of the components, the whole system falls apart. Therefore, the system could not evolve in kind of a piecewise manner, right? You couldn't build it up from simpler components because you need every part of it in order for that system to function. And there's so many problems with that framing. So we can talk however you want to go. We can talk specifically about the citric acid cycle, or we could talk kind of more broadly about that type of argument, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if we provide an explanation for how the citric acid cycle evolved. This just leads to a game I call creationist whack-a-mole. They're just going to come up with another one and say, well, you don't know how this one evolved. Okay,
well, let's
here's how
be
that one
fair.
goes.
So when Behe said that you're never going to find an explanation for this, it had turned out that before he gave his testimony on that the half a dozen things that he presented on stand, he already knew that each one of those half dozen things had already been disproved. He was originally going to go in with one or two other things, but those were also indefensible. Kenneth Miller himself had disproved every one of these things, where there's no explanation, there's no incremental evolutionary pathway by which this could have evolved. Miller showed that there is for all of these things. And so if we're going to deal with this appropriately, and they say that there's no scientific explanation for the Krebs cycle, which, by the way, this is what the creationists said. I note that this was not what the abstract said. And I can't get to the further article, so I don't know if that's what the abstract is, if that's what the article is complaining about really either, because it was vague and confusing and poorly written. There was punctuation was missing where it should be. I had to read it through a few times to try to make sense of without punctuation. It was difficult to read. This is a peer-reviewed scientific paper that obviously nobody's paying attention to in the peer review process. But we should at least deal with the claim being made. If they're saying that scientists can't explain the evolution of the Krebs cycle, there's no evolutionary pathway for the Krebs cycle, then I guess we're going to have to put on our biology boots, and act like it's 8th grade, and let's sit through class.
Let's do
Dr.
it.
Dan.
So there are two levels that we need to look at this. We're first kind of because the way creationists often will go with this, and taking one argument kind of in a vacuum, it's kind of impossible to kind of read their mind and know exactly what they intend the argument to be. But the two ways they go with this is kind of the broader, almost like abiogenesis kind of argument, right? It's like this is an aspect of cell biology that could not evolve abiotically. Therefore, you need an intelligent origin, a creative origin, a divine origin, however you want to frame it, for living cells. But then the other way to look at it is kind of a smaller scale argument. This specific trait on its own, this cycle, the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, this thing could not evolve. It is too complex. It's beyond that threshold. So we can kind of take those kind of one at a time. And don't worry, it's not super complicated to understand why these are both wrong. It's actually really easy. So the first kind of thing to understand with that first framing of the argument, the kind of broader abiogenesis kind of aspect to that argument, is that what we're talking about here is a type of chemical reaction called oxidation, which fundamentally just means you're removing electrons from a compound and that breaks it down. So like we do oxidation to get energy. We take in carbon in our food and these big molecules and we oxidize them, and that results in CO2, which we exhale as a waste. And in those series of chemical reactions, we kind of harvest energy from them in the form of electrons. So what we need is, can we do that without like cells existing? Can we get that type of reaction happening in the absence of cells? And bonus, can we do it with carbon compounds that are related to the existing citric acid cycle? And it turns out the answer is yes. There's been a ton of research. Just, you can Google this, just in the last like 5-6 years. The compound that I want to just mention, it's acetate, or acetic acid is the acid form. Acetate is the conjugate base. And this is a simple organic carbon compound. And acetate, oxidation, and then the opposite of those are called reduction reactions. And you smush those words together, and it's called redox reactions because they always happen together. It's called coupling. If you oxidize one thing, you always reduce something else. So we're looking for redox reactions involving acetate. And it turns out these things happen spontaneously. You can document spontaneous redox reactions involving acetate happening in places like deep sea hydrothermal vents. And you can also look at the sediments of those types of environments, even if they're no longer right in that environment right now. You can go and find the byproducts of those reactions, abiotic byproducts, going back billions of years to around the origin of the type of respiration that involves the citric acid cycle, the type of cellular metabolism that involves the citric acid cycle. So we have evidence of these processes, and kind of the molecule that feeds into the citric acid cycle is this thing called acetyl-CoA. So you need acetate to kind of start that process. That's what feeds into it in kind of the main form of cellular respiration that we all do when our cells make energy in the mitochondria. We have evidence of those molecules doing those types of reactions abiotically, going back billions of years, which should be sufficient to remove the abiogenesis aspect to this. So look, those are the reactions.
Were you there?
I was not. But as my friend R.J. Downard likes to say, the rocks were there. The rocks were there. They witnessed it, and they can tell us what happened. And that's the key. And I want to be clear for everybody, we're not finding like all of the little intermediate molecules in those layers. But what we're finding are organic molecules doing those types of reactions and the types of organic molecules that are involved in that cycle, right? Like acetate. Once you have organic carbon doing those types of reactions, getting like different types of organic carbon to do it is pretty darn easy. It's not that complicated to futz with the actual molecules, right? It's getting the reactions to happen in the first place is the hard step, right? So that's the kind of broader abiogenesis side of things. We can get the molecules that are relevant doing the types of reactions that are relevant. We know that happened without cellular life doing it billions of years ago. That's the first half.
Okay. And
So
I'm tempted to pull up some of the rulings of the court. You know, when Behe made all of these implausible claims, and the judge is saying, well, Behe is just flat out ignoring this and assuming this other thing without justification, and he's rejecting that. You know, here is the explanation given. He just says it's not good enough because you know, faith means never admitting when you're wrong. And if you believe in lies, don't ever admit that. Just keep lying. Even when everybody knows you're lying, even when everybody knows that you know that they know that you're lying, keep lying.
So that gets us to the kind of the second half, which is directly relevant to Michael Behe. And by the way, as you were talking, I was thinking about the trial. It was blood clotting, it was eyes, it was the bacterial flagellum. And for everybody with the blood clotting example, it was really classic because, again, the idea with this argument is you have a system. If you remove a part, the system doesn't work. Well, with blood clotting, it turns out, yes, the human system, right? We need all these little intermediate molecules in the signaling cascade to make it work. There are other organisms that are missing some of those signals, but they don't like persistently suffer from hemophilia. Their blood clotting cascade is just simpler, and it doesn't need all those things. It's a direct observational refutation of the idea that that trait is actually irreducibly complex as Behe defined it. And that's the case for like all of this stuff. So bringing this back to the Krebs cycle, there's two ways to approach this. One, can we find kind of simpler versions of this type of cellular metabolism out there? Can we find versions that don't do the complete cycle or maybe don't do it at all, right? That would be a precursor that would build up to the more complex form that we see in many things today. And then the second one is, can we look at the genes involved? And can we figure out the evolutionary history of those genes? Because remember, even though creationists like to poo-poo the field of phylogenetics or the practice of phylogenetics, there's actually papers that experimentally validate these techniques where they're allowing, for example, viruses to evolve experimentally with a known pattern of divergence. And then they sample those viruses and they do the phylogenetic techniques and recreate that exact pattern correctly based on the phylogenetic techniques. So there's experimental validation here. We're not just like, we weren't there, we don't know if it actually happened that way. Like, these techniques are experimentally verified to accurately recreate the evolutionary histories we're talking about. So sticking with that one just for a moment, we can look at the genes involved in the various steps of the citric acid cycle, and we can very clearly document their evolutionary history. And we're normally talking about this right now in eukaryotes, things like us, the cells that have nuclei. And those genes are in our nuclear DNA. They're actually mostly not expressed in the teeny little bit of DNA that mitochondria have in our cells. Mitochondria, these teeny little remnants of bacteria that our ancestors ingested like 2 billion years ago, or whatever it was, 2-ish billion. So we can look at that evolutionary history, but we can even go back further, and we could find those genes in the specific type of bacteria that is the closest ancestor to those little mitochondria in our own cells. There's free living bacteria that are closely related to them based on the DNA that they both have. And we could go and look at the versions of genes that those bacteria have and see the similarities between the ones that we have in our own nucleus. So there's this process called horizontal gene transfer where the genes actually change locations. And we could reconstruct this entire evolutionary history. It's beautiful. And I encourage everybody to Google it. We could go through the whole thing, but it would take, 90 minutes. And I think that would probably not be, where we want to go here. But like, I encourage everyone to look this up.
If you're down with that, I would like to do an episode just on horizontal gene transfer, because
that'd be great.
The reason that I'm interested in that is because everybody wants to argue with me that everything didn't come from a single cell, and that we didn't evolve from a single cell, and literally we didn't, because evolution is descent with inherent modification. That means ancestor descendant relationship. Horizontal gene transfer means that the origin of eukarya, for example, came not from a single ancestor, but from a web, like a mesh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way to think about this, and this is a little off topic for everybody, but it's worth noting because it is a common misconception when we're talking about things like this. Like, the human genome does not have a single linear evolutionary pathway. Each different little part has its own independent evolutionary history, and most of them are very similar to each other in their evolutionary histories, but there are parts that are not. That there's where we've acquired genetic material from other things along the way, and if you sequence one part of the genome and then one of these horizontally acquired parts, they're actually going to show very different evolutionary histories, and that's an important thing to keep in mind here. That
we also have to. I'm sorry. We also have to explain that that this doesn't work on the level of multicellular organisms the way that it does on unicellular organisms. I mean, unicellular organisms could literally crash into each other and share genetic material. But multicellular organisms like that, like you might get one infected cell, but it's not necessarily going to affect every other cell.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just thought it would be an important point if somebody were to get confused. That's if they're still thinking at this point in our conversation.
So bringing this back specifically to the Krebs cycle, the kind of teeny little background here is that the Krebs cycle is a series of a whole bunch of steps. Off the top of my head, I couldn't even tell you how many steps. Eight-ish steps, about 8 or 10 steps, give or take. It's been so long since I took biochemistry. 8 or 10 steps, and each step is catalyzed by a specific enzyme. And if you look just mechanistically at it, right? So put aside the genetics, just look mechanistically at each of these steps. You can go through the history of those different reactions kind of on their own and see that they are also used independently in different contexts within not just eukaryotic cells, but the more ancestral bacterial cells that are closely related to those mitochondria compartments in our own cells. And this is important because it gets at one of the major faults with this idea of irreducible complexity. And
Hold
it's
on a
this.
second before you
Go
get
ahead.
there. Is that people don't need to, when they think about mitochondria, they don't realize that mitochondria are themselves bacteria.
Right. They're kind of reduced bacterial cells that at one
So
point
our cells, all of our cells have bacterial cells living in them that power them. So most of the cells in your body are not your own.
That's a good way to think about it. So we have these mitochondria that are derived from bacterial cells. We can still find close relatives of those ancestral bacteria free living out in the world today. They're called alpha proteobacteria. They're a thing. And the thing that we can see in those cells is that each of these reactions is doing it. You can do the full cycle, but each of those reactions also has their own context where they're doing their own thing that's not the full Krebs cycle. And this is important because this idea of irreducible complexity ignores an evolutionary concept called exaptation. And exaptation is when you take one thing that has one job and it evolves to do a different job. And you could think of that like really simply like feathers is a great example of exaptation because we know
Penguin wings.
Right. We know that feathers predate flight. So feathers were originally for thermoregulation, regulating your body temperature.
And sexual display as well.
And sexual displays. And
that was another
later,
thermal regulation, then sexual display, then incubating a larger clutch of eggs.
Yep.
And then hunt and fight or flight, and then flight.
And then eventually true flight. They went through a bunch of these different stages. So you can't just point to feathers and go, how would you get a flight feather out of nothing? Well, you wouldn't, because it had all of these other things that it was adapted to do before they were for flight. The same is true for the steps in biochemical pathways. You can take complex biochemical pathways, break them down to their parts, and I bet you can find for not just the citric acid cycle, but for a lot of different biochemical pathways, you're going to find other contexts where those different enzymes are being used to do something else. They're doing the same, they're catalyzing the same reaction, but they're doing it for a different reason. They're accomplishing a different overall function utilizing that reaction. And it's only later that they end up assembled in this larger context. And this destroys the concept of irreducible complexity because the point, as Behe articulated it, is that you can't select, right, step by step to get to the complex thing because it doesn't do the function of the complex thing at each intermediate step. But if each intermediate step does a different function, it doesn't matter. You're still selecting for those intermediate steps. And that breaks this entire argument. I think the creationists that say you can't evolve this are ignoring the fact that those enzymes can do other things.
I wish I could remember what it was off the top of my head, but somebody made a challenge that I couldn't explain. It wasn't ATP synthase, I think it was.
Yeah.
There's no scientific explanation for that. As if, let's look back that this was 100 years ago. We've got scientific explanations now for like just practically everything. But let's imagine that it was 100 years ago, and we don't know anything about microbiology or cell biology or genetics or any of it. The fact that we didn't know things 100 years ago, whatever we didn't know 100 years ago, was that evidence of magic? Was our ignorance ever evidence of magic? And in all of our research, every time we've discovered what the real explanation is, it never turned out to be magic. Funny thing. So somebody tells me that we can't find the explanation for ATP synthase, and then I look it up and I find 2 studies in Germany and in Japan that are detailing the specific pathway and then they get to this point, and then they have a mutation in this other chromosome, which causes this other thing. Then there's this other mutation that causes this other thing, and then you build it that way. And I couldn't explain it out as with the level of complexity that they. And I knew that it would be like Trump sitting through his own criminal trial. People would be falling asleep if I tried to give it that way. But so I simplified it. Then there's a mutation in this other part that changes this, and it goes to this other part. But here's a very simple explanation. Yes, German, Japanese research group both explained this. You're telling me that, and now that there is an explanation, does that disprove God? No, it's like you said, whack-a-mole. Okay, we won't bring that one up, not with anybody that knows what they're talking about. We will know that there is a scientific explanation, but we're going to go to somebody who doesn't know that, and then we'll make the same boast.
Yep.
Until they figure out that the same thing that these other people figured out. And then when we run out of people who don't know that, then we'll stop using it.
Or they'll stop using it to a critical audience, but they'll still use it to a friendly audience, which is something that I've seen a lot, where you'll have a creationist, even a professional, right? A professional credentialed creationist. I've witnessed this with my own eyes, where you have somebody, creationist talking to non-creation biologist, right? Somebody with expertise, and they bring up an argument, and the creationist, the credentialed, I'll say creation scientist, to delineate that they have actual biology credentials, they will make the more defensible form of the argument. And then within a short time frame, close time frame, another event, either before or after, they'll make the indefensible version of that same argument to a creationist audience. And it is infuriating to see that, because you all know better. You know better than to do that.
Yeah.
But
I've seen it myself. I've seen it myself, where the creationist brings up an argument to me. I shoot it down, and I show why it's faulty. So he goes to a different argument, knowing that there's no way to defend that when he goes to a completely different strategy. But then goes on to the next guy. I see the video where he's talking to the next guy after me, and he brings up the same argument that wouldn't work with me, but it will work against this other guy. So he knows that it's false, but he's going to bring it up anyway.
I have seen that.
I don't understand.
Thing.
I don't understand what it is with creationists. Why do you want to believe things that are not true? And some of them, a few of them, I know this is not the case for everybody, but a few of them have admitted to me that they know it's not true, but they don't care. They're going to believe it anyway. And I don't understand. How do you believe something that you know is not true? But I've gotten several admissions to that. Glenn Morton said famously that he would be a young Earth creationist on Saturday and Sunday, but he's an old Earth evolutionist Monday through Friday, because he was working in the petrogeology. He's working for the fossil fuel industry.
And I know a few people that are doing that, and they use traditional geology, old Earth principles and radiometric dating and such, to find where the deposits are going to be, to accurately predict where those deposits are going to be. And this is one of those great examples of if, in this case, flood geology, if whatever it is was accurate, you would have people using it to make money. But they're not.
Yeah.
You have people using
how we
understand geology to work.
Let's be fair. These creationists are making bank.
That is true. That is
Answers in Genesis earns something like, I say earned, I can't use the word earn. They bring in about $40 million a year. Ray Comfort lives in a $4 million mansion on the beach in Malibu or Monterey Bay, one or the other. And then Kent Hovind has his retirement home built by a slave camp. He made millions of dollars just having people give him money. I'm in the wrong. I will give you money if you will lie to me and convince me that these lies are true, because I want to pretend things that I know are not real.
I've looked at these things before and thought, man, I'm in the wrong profession, and I could do a better job than Nathaniel Jeanson and all these guys. I could do a better job than that.
Right?
How much do you think AIG would pay me? Because I could do a way better job.
I'm thinking I could I could so sell an audience as a preacher. It just, I can even handle venomous snakes. I mean,
There you go.
got
Go
this
old
shit
school.
down. It's just these damned ethics.
I do want to, while we're on the topic, I want to remind the audience that occasionally the people we're talking about are upfront about this. And my favorite example of this is Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He currently works for AIG. But when he was fresh out of grad school, having gotten a PhD from Harvard, he then went to work at Institute for Creation Research, ICR.
Wow.
And in this little like introductory blurb on the ICR website, which you can still find if you Google Jeanson ICR New Research Associate, I think is the phrase that it's he has a little bit in there where he talks about how I asked myself about like how can I use my degree to for temporary gain or to influence eternity. So the phrase that he used was use and abuse his credentials to put forward, to promote creation science. And it was like that. He said that out loud. He said, like, I'm going to use and abuse my credentials. I'm going to lie to you in the service of this idea that, like, I just got a PhD from Harvard, didn't come up. Like, there's a reason for that. And but I'm going to lie to you anyway. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what
remarkable.
to do about
The way that I see the whole evolution versus creation, or in fact, atheism versus theism, really the huge divide there, honestly, is whether you're honest or not, whether you care what the truth is, or whether you're okay with lying to yourself and others to believe things that are not evidently true nor even possible. That's what it really comes down to. I told somebody today that he said that atheism is not truth, or something to that effect. I'm like, well, yeah, atheism is not necessarily a quest for truth, but a quest for truth will eventually, inevitably lead to atheism, because it means that you're not going to be saying things that you're not going to say things are true unless you can show the truth of it. If there's a probability that what you're saying could be disproved tomorrow, or you don't really know what you're saying, then maybe you will have the wisdom, the wherewithal to say, say I believe or I read this thing. Because if you can show that you read it, you can show that it's written somewhere. Now you're in the clear, right? According to this magazine X, and you can show that magazine actually said X. Okay, good. Now you're safe. But when you start saying baseless speculation and you're asserting that as fact, when you tell me what, like the Pope did, when the Pope said that God will allow atheists into heaven, how the fuck does he know that? I mean, let's just forget that there's no God for a moment. Let's pretend for a moment that there is. How would the Pope know? Seriously, if the Mormon prophet can't know that, the Pope can't know that. Who can? All these people are just making up shit on the fly. So if you care about what the truth is, you're not going to say things are true until you can show the truth of it, the facts that back it up to show that it's true. The thing I hate the most about religion is when people make these empty assertions, when they tell you Jesus loves you and all kinds of details about a God they can't prove exists at all. How do you know so many specific things about it? And isn't it curious that everybody's God hates all the same things that they hate for the same reasons that they hate them? Anyway, do continue.
Yes.
Have we finished the Krebs?
Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it, because again, the claim is that it can't evolve because it is an irreducibly complex system. But what we find is that the individual steps in the cycle do actually operate independently in other biochemical contexts, which means it's not irreducible. It's just doing a different thing. Yeah, if you have the steps operating on their own, or you have little subsets of it, it's no longer the Krebs cycle. Okay, check that box. It checks the criteria, right, for irreducible complexity as Behe defined it. but that is not a barrier to a thing evolving, right?
So
You
I'm going to
break it
read a
down into
couple.
other steps.
Yeah, Behe brought up three things, three claims of irreducible complexity in Kitzmiller versus Dover, and I want to bring those up. I read through the entire thing and pulled out the specific sentences that I thought most closely related to each other. So Behe made the statement that removing any part of the bacterial flagellum will prevent it from acting as a rotary motor. The opinion of the court was Professor Behe excludes by definition the possibility that a precursor to the bacterial flagellum functioned not as a rotary motor, but in some other way, for example, as a secretory system. Behe said, science will never find an evolutionary explanation for the immune system. The opinion of the court is he was presented with 58 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and several immunology textbook chapters about the evolution of the immune system. However, he simply stated that this was not sufficient evidence of evolution and that it was not good enough. Because never, ever concede any point, not when you believe nothing but lies. Behe said each and every element of the complex cascade of enzymes and cofactors must be in place for blood clotting to work. The opinion of the court was the evolution of complex molecular systems can occur in several ways. Natural selection can bring together parts of a system for one function at one time and then at a later time recombine those parts with other systems of components to produce a system that has a different function. The complex biochemical cascade resulting in blood clotting has been explained in this fashion. Moreover, cross-examination revealed that Professor Behe's redefinition of the blood clotting system was likely designed to avoid peer-reviewed scientific evidence that falsifies his argument, as it was not a scientifically warranted redefinition. What a surprise! A creationist redefined terms to make it work in their argument.
Yes, and those exchanges just beautifully illustrate so many of the little tactics that creationists use. So one of them is kind of that very subtle redefinition, right? You see this with the word evolution. You see this with the word fitness. You see this all the time, where we're just going to just tweak the definition kind of stealthily. And now all of a sudden we're having a different conversation, but now there's a trap laid, right, for the non-creationist there.
There's another one that they read it. There's another one people need to be aware of, another redefinition that they've done. So historically, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, Darwinism referred to evolutionary theory in the 19th century, that the two mechanisms that were known, natural and sexual selection, that were known at that time, right? And then it was neo-Darwinism, and then for the 20th century, and then the 21st century is modern evolutionary synthesis, whatever. So that was one definition of Darwinism. There was another that if we were still in the 19th century, and there's a significant people who still held to Lamarckian evolution, Lamarckism, it would make sense if you said you were a Darwinist, meaning that you accept natural selection as an actual mechanism rather than the bogus theory of acquired characteristics. There aren't any Lamarckians anymore. So that use of the word Darwinian or Darwinism doesn't make any sense anymore. So now what they've done is they've redefined Darwinism such that evolution essentially means just microevolution, and macroevolution has been replaced by the word Darwinism. So that Darwinism becomes the religious belief of molecules to men. That is not what the word ever meant. That's not what the word means in science. But creationists, intelligent design theorists, professional liars have come up with these redefinitions so that they can continue pushing their arguments on bogus terms that they know are false, but they don't care because you're still paying them money to lie to you anyway.
I actually have personal experience with this very specific thing because on my YouTube channel, Creation Myths, check it out, everybody. This is what I do. I actually had Michael Behe on. I've had him on twice, so we've talked for about an hour each time. And one of the two appearances was specifically to talk about irreducible complexity. And part of that conversation was his use of the word Darwinism. And what he said to me, and you can go and find this, isn't like some obscure thing. He said this to me live on YouTube. The video's still there. He said to me that when he uses the word Darwinism, He is referring to any evolutionary mechanism that is I don't remember if he used the word random specifically, but any non-directed mechanism, I think is the phrase he used.
How is
And
there a directed mechanism?
well, that's the first problem. But the second problem, and actually what I consider the first problem, is okay, so we're not just talking about like selection, which is, Darwinism in the traditional sense is variation. We don't know how it got there, but variation plus selection leads to change over generations. That's Darwinian evolution. But now we're layering onto that genetic mechanisms like mutation, which we didn't know was the basis for variation back when Darwin was actually alive and writing. Genetic drift, which neutral theory, right? These non-selective processes. The whole point of Darwinism, if you want to like draw a circle around what Darwinian evolution is what Darwin wrote about. You can't put genetic drift in that circle. That is a random process. That is a non-selective process. But Behe just straight up said, when I use the word Darwinism, I'm referring to all of these non-directed mechanisms, basically all evolutionary processes he considers Darwinism, which is just not what that word means. Just straight up, that's not what that word means. And he knows that.
So I think there was another 19th century example of this kind of thing, was when Humpty Dumpty said that when I say glory, I mean a knockdown argument. Those not familiar with the literature,
Sorry.
Humpty Dumpty and Alice through the looking glass, they're having an argument, and Humpty Dumpty has redefined all these words. And she's trying to argue, but that's not what that means. He says, when I use a word, it means precisely what I mean it to mean, no more, no less. And I've had so many arguments with creationists that exactly match that Humpty Dumpty Alice thing that sometimes I'll just put up that page of the book in an image as my reply. All right, so Dr. Daniel Stern Cardinale, thank you very much once again for being on. And I'm going to look for another opportunity to have you on again, because these are always fun for me.
Yeah, always happy to. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, everybody.